Good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Supporting Survivors of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, hosted by SIPA's Institute of Global Politics Women Initiative and Kent Global Leadership Program on Conflict Resolution. My name is Keren Yarhi-Milo. I am the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs here at Columbia and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this important convening. It's the second in our virtual roundtable series on conflict-related sexual violence. And I would like to begin by thanking Sheryl Sandberg, Jen Klein, and Rachel Vogelstein of IGP's Women's Initiative, and Jean-Marie Guenmo of the Kent Global Leadership Program on Conflict Resolution for bringing us together around this critical issue. Today's discussion builds on our September 17 convening on increasing accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. Today, we turn our attention to survivors and to the policies and programs that help them heal and rebuild. As you can see across conflicts around the world, survivors continue to face lasting harm. They experience physical injury, psychological trauma, displacement, social stigma. Recovery is not only about receiving medical care or financial assistance. It's also about restoring dignity and creating spaces where survivors can speak up and help shape the policies that affect their own lives. At the same time, we see powerful examples of resilience and leadership in support of survivors. Many women's groups, civil society organizations, and local governments are advancing survivor-centered approaches that include legal recognition, reparation, and programs for economic and social empowerment. These efforts are important and they're critical, and they show that lasting recovery and peace depend on justice that heeds and lifts up survivors' voices. So I want to really thank everybody for joining us for this important dialogue, this important work that we do in IGP on this topic at Columbia, and it's done elsewhere. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panelists and from all of you participating today. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to my friend Sheryl Sandberg. Thank you, Sheryl, for your important leadership and advocacy on ending conflict-related sexual violence around the world. Over to you, Sheryl. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Keren. I want to start also by recognizing the extraordinary people who make this event possible. Keren, your leadership and your personal friendship. Jen Klein and Rachel Vogelstein, if you ever want anything done, you just work with them, and the focus and the dedication and the execution is always so impressive. Professor Jean-Marie Guenmo, thank you for sponsoring this roundtable series. So this is our second panel in our series on conflict-related sexual violence. Our first panel focused on accountability for perpetrators. Today, we're focusing on recognition and recovery for survivors and what it takes to make sure they can truly heal and truly thrive. This work could not be more urgent. Conflict-related sexual violence is on the rise, increased by 25% last year compared to 2023, and women and girls account for 92% of the victims. Across the world, we know that survivors are living with deep and lasting scars. From South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Syria and Ukraine, people are carrying the trauma of violence and doing the hard, brave work of rebuilding their lives. And we know that this takes a very serious toll. Survivors often face lifelong health challenges, reproductive injuries, infections, chronic pain, along with invisible wounds like PTSD, depression, and the stigma and isolation that can last for generations. Last year, I had the honor of hosting a conversation with Dr. Denis Mukwege, who, as many of you know, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on this issue. He told me something I'll never forget. What he said is that conflict-related sexual violence is such a compelling way to wage war because it's free, meaning you don't have to buy bombs, you don't have to go buy guns, the equipment you need to perpetuate it, you don't have to pay. And it doesn't just destroy those people, it destroys whole communities. And that is why this continues to happen. And that is why we need to make sure we're doing everything to support survivors. Unfortunately, even when the laws promise justice, survivors are too often forced to wait years for it. And accessing reparations can be painfully slow and complex, bureaucratic. Systems were never designed for this in mind. But I think we come together at a moment where there's real hope. There's growing recognition that justice for survivors must be part of peace, that accountability, reparations, and long-term support for survivors and for children born of wartime rape are inseparable from lasting stability. No one understands all of this better than the incredible panelists joining us today, and I'm honored to introduce them. Esther Diggenmums, and for any mispronunciation, I so apologize. I'm very bad at this. The Executive Director of the Global Survivors Fund. She is a leading expert on survivor-centered responses to conflict-related sexual violence and has spent her whole career advancing the right to reparations for survivors. Kristina Kit, the head of the Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association, JURFEM. She leads efforts to promote gender equality, protect women's rights, and advance justice for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. Grace Ahan, survivor and advocate from Uganda. She co-founded the Women's Advocacy Network to amplify the voices of women affected by conflict-related sexual violence. And now she works with the Global Survivors Fund to ensure survivor-led reparations will be made. And Asna Josic, the president of the Forgotten Children of War in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She founded the association to fight for recognition and rights for children time rape and led the successful advocacy for the world's first law recognizing and protecting them. Thank you all for being here and for your leadership.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your leadership and partnership on behalf of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Welcome once again to our panelists. My name is Rachel Vogelstein. I lead the Women's Initiative at Columbia's Institute of Global Politics. And I'd like to begin our discussion with our panelists by talking about best practices to support survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Grace, let's start with you. You survived the Lord's Resistance Army conflict in Uganda and in 2011 went on to found the Women's Advocacy Network, a community-based organization that works across northern Uganda with women who survived sexual violence in that conflict. Can you tell us, based on your own experience and your work with survivors, what kinds of interventions and support are most important for survivors of this human rights abuse? Grace, you're on mute and we want to hear you.
Sorry, Rachel. So in my experience, I have seen that survivors of sexual violence need not only one kind of support, they need support, and this support vary. Not only can you say they need apology for being violated, but they also want to live in a society that is peaceful, that is respectful, the society that doesn't stigmatize them. They also want to live. It's hard. We talk of, when it comes to reparations, we talk of restoration. But when sexual violence, as we all know, the gravity, it's very hard to really repair someone, to restore someone to that point. So survivors of sexual violence need to be supported to live once again economically well. Not only that, as you all know, I'll give you a point. For example, in northern Uganda, these girls, they were then girls when they were violated, and now they have returned with children as women and without a means of livelihood. It's hard for them to live on, to continue living. Just like elsewhere in the world, sexual violence puts a woman down to the extent that a woman loses everything they own, their dignity, their source of livelihood, even the sense of living in the community, given the culture. Some of our cultures are not all that to the point, and they go on like speaking negative things to the point that even getting married is a problem after going through sexual violence. So it's total peace that should come from the community, and it should be really from the heart of the people in the community. It should not be said in words, because if it is said in words and it is not put into action, it makes no sense. Survivors need justice. And in this justice, I always talk about justice in several ways. I do not only look at legal justice. Some survivors need legal justice. They want to see that their perpetrators are brought to books, are held accountable for what they did. Others only need apology from their perpetrators. All they want to hear is, I did this to you because of this reason, and that is enough for them. Some survivors need all of this. Medical support. Some survivors need all of these four that I've counted in order to heal, in order to be. Some others only need that. They only want that the children with whom they have produced as a result of violence and conflict, are living a better life, a life that they are not reminded time and again of what went in the life of their mothers. Basically, that's what I can say. Precisely, that's it.
Grace,
Thank
that
you.
is an important agenda. And Esther, I want to bring you in as well, given your efforts at the Global Survivors Fund, where you've also worked directly with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence around the world, from Darfur to the DRC to Colombia to Syria. And you've noted in your work that survivors face a range of consequences that we just heard about from Grace, from permanent physical injuries to debilitating psychological trauma to stigmatization from their communities. And you've highlighted that adequately addressing these harms requires resources, but typically access to reparations or other forms of redress for survivors historically have not been prioritized either nationally or internationally. So tell us why the right to reparations is so important for survivors to achieve the justice that Grace was just talking about, and what needs to be done to ensure that reparations systems work in practice.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And let me start by saying what an honor it is to be part of this panel together with the other speakers. So thank you for the invitation. And indeed, building around what Grace said, I think reparation is first and foremost important because it's really a survivor's priority. Survivors want to recover. They want to rebuild their lives that are often completely shattered, but they also want to live in dignity. And for that, what Grace mentioned, the apology, the acknowledgement can be really important. So to officially hear, you are a victim, you're a victim of war, you're not to blame, and harm has been done to you. That's really important aspect of reparation. Too often, I believe we think that reparation is something very big, it's not feasible, it's not affordable. But from our work, I think we are clearly seeing that that is not the case. And also that reparation does not have to be an afterthought or come really late in a transitional justice process. No, on the contrary, it must be really a priority. So at the beginning. And what we see, the relation with justice, if you're actually offering concrete avenues for healing, for rebuilding, for that recognition, soon after the crimes are committed, that already gives a sense of justice. And then subsequently, it helps survivors walk through that, what can be a very difficult path to justice, where the survivors will face interrogations and doubts, sometimes years of waiting, evidentiary issues, etc. So, as Grace said, as far as possible, repair to survivor can really fight for justice. So what needs to be done to make that work in practice? Well, at Global Survivors Fund, we work with civil society to provide what we call interim reparative measures for survivors with survivors. And we use those projects, those measures, to show governments that reparation is actually feasible, it's affordable, has a huge impact. And then we accompany the same governments in scaling that work up and setting up domestic reparation programs themselves. That's what we did in Ukraine, for example. We'll be hearing more from Christina about that through the pilot project on urgent interim reparation. Now there's the world's first law for domestic reparation program for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence while the conflict is still ongoing. That law has been adopted and is now in the process of being implemented. So it really shows reparation is possible. But it's not only showing that feasibility and that affordability, it's also really the process. For reparation to work in practice, multi-stakeholder approach is essential. It cannot only be done by states, even if they are the duty bearers. It requires that collaboration, radical collaboration with different stakeholders and including survivors. To include survivors in that process of really working together, we use co-creation as a methodology. That means really starting by the question, what does reparation actually mean to you? And how can it be done? How can it be safe? How can it not have negative consequences? And then through that process of really collaborating together, co-creation, we see how survivors can feel safe, how they can come forward, but particularly what is meaningful in terms of reparation for them, because that can mean really different things in different contexts. In Colombia, if you allow me to mention a few examples, for indigenous women, reparation, really interestingly, is the protection of the rivers, the pollution of which they associate with sexual violence. In Syria, survivors are asking to set up businesses or go back to university, for example. In Cambodia, the grandmothers and the grandfathers that our partners work with, they are victims of forced marriages during the Khmer Rouge regime. They asked for education for their grandchildren as reparation. So it really depends on the context. And I want to just mention one example, one quote that I really like from a survivor in Nepal. And she said, through interim reparative measures, I have found new hope to live. My daughter and I are even able to cook and enjoy a meal of white rice in our own home, something I never thought would be possible. It's a simple joy, but to us it means the world. So I really think that is that contextualized meaning of reparation.
Esther, thank you for that demonstration of how and why reparative measures work and are so effective. Christina, I want to pull you into this discussion about reparations as well. You founded and lead JERFEM, a Ukrainian Women's Lawyers Association, and you coordinate an expert group on conflict-related sexual violence at the Prosecutor General's office. And in this capacity, you've advised the Ukrainian government on its groundbreaking reparations system, which, as Esther just talked about, legally recognize survivors of sexual violence as civilian victims of war, even while conflict is ongoing. So what lessons do you think other countries, whether in active conflict or in post-conflict contexts, can draw from Ukraine's system of reparations for survivors? What is working well under Ukraine's system and why?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, dear colleagues, for the invitation and opportunity to discuss issues of support for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence together with you. I also want to thank the Global Survivors Fund and Esther for their assistance in building the reparation system in Ukraine and implementing the project for interim reparation for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. The implementation of urgent interim reparation for survivors of CRSV in Ukraine is an important example of partnership between the state, civil society organization, and international organization. In 2022, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the identification of thousands of Russian crimes against Ukrainians, we began working on developing a draft law on urgent interim reparation for survivors of CRSV. This initiative was led by Member of Parliament Marina Bardiana and her assistant Albina Basista, who invited us to join the working group to prepare the draft law. In 2023, EURFAM, together with Global Survivors Fund, organized a study visit to Geneva for a group of government officials, parliamentarians, law enforcement officers, and organizations uniting survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. The purpose of this visit was to finalize work on the draft law on urgent interim reparation and to unite all stakeholders in advocating for its adoption. After the visit, the draft law was finalized and adopted in November last year, 2024. Experts from a civil society organization and international organization played a crucial role in developing the draft law, its adoption, and the creation of implementation documents. Also, since 2022, we have been working to support the government in building a response system for conflict-related sexual violence, implementing victim-oriented approach in the justice system, and ensuring coordination between all actors. Ukraine's experience is unique in that under condition of full-scale war, we need to build a survivor support system and change justice system approach to communication and interaction with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Of course, this is not easy, as resources, both human and financial, are limited. Every person in Ukraine is a survivor or witnesses of Russian crimes of aggression and other war crimes. However, we have no choice, as people need support and victims cannot wait for the war to end. The longer people live with trauma, the deeper it becomes and the harder it will be to help people later. That is why, having studied international experience, we have created a Witnesses and Victim Support Center in General Prosecutor Office. We are also building a support system in the courts and also advocating for the implementation of the law on urgent interim reparation for survivors of CRSV. Therefore, our task, both at the international community and Ukrainian society, is to ensure minimum standards of support and assistance to survivors despite their war and to continue building survivor-centered services. I am a lawyer, and when I provide legal aid for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, I understand that if we cannot guarantee all reparation for survivors of CRSV, we cannot guarantee justice for them, because for most of survivors, verdict on the national level or international level, of course, is important, but more important for them is the very strong reparation system, support system for them, and only after that they will feel justice in general. Thank you.
The very helpful exemplification of ensuring justice in practice rather than in theory, and really appreciate that overview of the way the reparation system has worked in Ukraine. Aina, I'd like to pull you into the discussion. One of the many consequences of conflict-related sexual violence is pregnancy, and I want to ask you about support for children who are born of rape in wartime. As the president of the Forgotten Children of War, you led a campaign for the world's first law recognizing children born of wartime rape as a distinct legal category. Tell us what it took to achieve that breakthrough, and why is state recognition of these children so important?
Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here on this panel discussion and have this conversation. I will just start with the fact about, knowing a bit more about children born out of war. I think it's not just case of Bosnia, it's in so many other post-conflict zones where we have a situation where children are vulnerable group, they are neglected and rejected by family, by system, by society. And I think when we talk about this long-term stigmatization and discrimination, silence, I think that being legally unrecognized is just one more thing, in the life of a child. And to bring this law, especially here in Bosnia, and what I have learned from other organizations in different countries, it was tough because of the social approach to the children. What I can tell that when we advocate for the law of the civilian victims of war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where children born out of wartime sexual violence are recognized as a victims. For us, it was the biggest obstacle was the fact that society is not educated, or society is still rejecting, because society has opinion that we talk about children of enemy. So when we talk about this ethnic environment like we live here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, first step and first thing that is take to get the result is try to raise awareness and try to get some critical group of people who will do educational programs in the different parts of the society. And it's not just, do some kind of education with, I don't know, people in small local communities, with the students. It's also about decision makers. It was really tough to understand that as a state, we had 20 to 50,000 of wartime rape survivors, and it was really hard to understand that there was no logical line that states that women can give a birth after that. And when you have this kind of bubble like we had in Bosnia, for children born out of war was really hard, not just professionally, but also it was hard in the terms of mental health and their, let's say, in their social circles, because when child speak publicly, it's not just that we speak about our stories. In this moment, when I speak with you, I speak also about my mother, about family. So, one of the maybe most important fact to understand that rape is not just problem of survivors. It really has these consequences in a family, in micro and micro surrounding. In the terms of the law, I think the fact that you are recognized by state through the law, I think that we don't talk about symbolic thing. We talk about something that is reparative for survivors and also for children. When the state finally sees you, that means that you are finally, that when state names you, that means that you are seen. That gives you opportunity to be protected from discrimination. That gives you opportunity to fight against discrimination, so-called fatherless child. That's also one of the problems that children were faced, because most of the children born out of rape in Bosnia, we don't have father's name, and it's obligatory in all institution, in all official documents of an individual. And within this law now we have a protection to tell someone, okay, you are not allowed anymore to ask me for this kind of data and this kind of identity, because now there is a clear set of rights when what we can use to be protected. And also the fact that you have a law, that means that your invisibility is over. That means that that sends this global message to mothers, but also to society, that children born out of war are not crime. And then it gives us another possibility to go on in the process of building peace and building equal space for children born out of war in Bosnia. So basically, I think that most of our work was, let's say, successful because we have created story together with the survivors, together with the legal experts, together with the international partners. So we had this approach trying to target all the things in the same time, because being child born out of war in Bosnia is also something that can be let's say, useful. We were raised here, and we know that sometimes that even when you get the law, even when you get the recognition, sometimes that is not enough for society to respect you. We had this case with our mothers, in 2006, our mothers and survivors, they were legally recognized. But still, in this moment, we still have a problem with stigmatization and discrimination. So being in this strong coalition and cooperation with survivors, we got this perfectly lesson learned and this first-hand experience that we try to use in our activism, in our association, trying to build, first of all, societal support, and then from that we went to the legal advocacy. But on the end, I think from not just from the association perspective, also from my personal experience, I think that but I can say that in other countries, if we have children who are really ready to speak up, who wants to fight this within society, I think that all organizations and all legal experts, generally experts, have to understand when child is speaking about this also that can affect their family, and also that we speak about war criminals who are mostly free people, and that we need to ensure adequate support for the children in process of advocacy, because I think on the end of the day, we have learned in Bosnia that safety and health of a child it's really important.
The link between recognition and access to justice from what you've just described is so clear. And Esther, I want to pull you into this part of the discussion. Thanks to Ina's work and the work of so many others, the recognition of children born of wartime rape is growing. For example, in the ICC's Angwen case, or under UN Security Council Resolution 2467, but recognition often remains tied to lengthy legal or reparative processes. And by the time these processes conclude, many of these children have actually reached adulthood. So you have documented cases where children have benefited from interim reparative measures, for example, through access to education as indirect beneficiaries under reparations that are granted to these children's mothers. So how can governments best ensure justice and support for children born of wartime rape while they're still young?
Yeah, that's a very important but also really difficult question, because how is it possible actually to repair the terrible mental and the physical scars that are profound, really, caused to children when they suffer sexual violence, or when they witness sexual violence, or when they're born from sexual violence? For example, right now in Sudan and DRC, I think it's really important to recognize that it is estimated that more than a third of the survivors of sexual violence are actually children. I personally believe the number is higher. I spoke recently in Chad with girls from Sudan who had never even told their mothers what had happened to them, let alone that they reported to services. So the underreporting is really there for children as well. And the unfortunate reality is that even children as small as babies are targeted, and for them we don't even know what the long-term consequences are going to be on their lives. So what we do know is that when domestic reparations programs are set up, they really should include children impacted by conflict-related sexual violence as victims entitled to reparation. Very few countries have done as such. Peru, Colombia, and Bosnia are examples. I know we just heard you talk about that. But even in those countries, there's a lot of obstacles, for example, for children to access legal identity, even if they can't identify who their father is. So lots of challenges. What we do know from our work is that children and their caretakers prioritize education as a form of reparation. Children affected by sexual violence often drop out from school, and if they do succeed in going back, the environment is often not conducive to their realities and to their needs. So the example of South Sudan, where we're trying to help these children reintegrate into the education system, it's not easy. And then when we've asked mothers, how do we avoid singling out these children, for example, they say, well, these children are already singled out because they're the last ones to eat, and they're the ones that wear the same clothes every day. And I think that's really telling how difficult it is for these children to even access education. So with that, education as a form of reparation needs to be more than that, needs to be more than access. It really needs to be healing, it needs to be reparative education. And I would just want to mention the example of one of our partners, the Neem Foundation in Nigeria. They do beautiful work providing education plus for children, for girls that have been affected by the Boko Haram insurgency. And this is trauma responsive education. It is value based. It is full of creative expression. The children are really accompanied at an individual level, but also in coordination with their families. It's an accelerated learning program to compensate or restitute in a way for the many years that they have missed out on education. And this type of education, that can be really, really reparative, and it can give a sense of justice. Like one survivor said, now that I'm going back to school, I have defeated Boko Haram. And I think that's very, very telling. So that's what governments need to do. They need to set up reparation programs inclusive of education, really trauma-informed, reparative education. I think that's the most realistic thing that governments can do to really meet that right to reparation of children affected by conflict-related sexual violence.
A very helpful illustration of the importance of repair, not only to individuals, but to the community and to overall stability in a post-conflict context. Grace, I'm going to turn back to you. Given your extensive work supporting survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and your leadership of survivor-led networks, tell us why it's so important for survivors themselves to be at the forefront of these policy efforts for justice. How do survivor voices shape policies like reparations and other social supports that we've been talking about? And how can we better ensure that solutions to address conflict-related sexual violence are survivor-led? I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rachel. First of all, including survivors in policy, in making policies that concern them, first of all, is a source of ownership. It gives them the space to really tell policymakers what exactly is needed for survivors. Like I normally say, it helps them to identify the exact need, and which exact need, when it is addressed, that is the reparation we're talking about. That is the justice we're talking about. If a survivor needs only psychosocial support, and that is there in policy, it is done, that is the healing that specific survivor will get. So it gives them, first of all, ownership. It allows their voices to be heard. And then thirdly, I think what Esther said is about co-creation. When you are part of something, you feel valued. By including survivors in what concerns them, it means, first of all, it's recognition as well. It is when survivors will get to know that the most common term that we use these days, that survivor-centeredness, we shall then know that that is indeed being put in practice. So this also should go to, it should not only go to policy making, it should go to its implementation as well. Survivors should be allowed to be part of any intervention from the beginning, its implementation, its monitoring. That's when you'll feel satisfied that it has really been done for us and in the right way. That's all I can say. Thank you.
So from the development of policies to address this harm to implementation of those policies, we need to be consulting survivors throughout that process. Christina, you've talked about the need to strengthen the ability of the judicial system to address harms of conflict-related sexual violence. And through your organization, you've invested heavily in capacity building among lawyers, prosecutors, and judges to improve support for survivors. What changes have you observed as a result of these efforts, and what kinds of approaches have proven to be most effective in shifting professional attitudes and practices on this issue in Ukraine?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. Of course, your firm works systematically and consistently in the direction of training the legal community on working with survivors of gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence. Since 2022, we have developed many training programs, both online and offline, as well as distance learning courses. We have trained prosecutors and investigators on how to investigate conflict-related sexual violence cases with a focus on survivors' needs, how to organize and conduct interviews with survivors, and why it is important to interact with other professionals who can provide services for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Changing approaches to investigate crimes and providing legal services to survivors is a very long process. Why? Because if you have been working for 10, 20 years with certain approaches, if survivors have been merely a source of evidence for you for decades, it is very difficult for you to change your practice. As of today, there is specialization of prosecutors and investigators in Ukraine who work with conflict-related sexual violence cases. All of them participate in many trainings, and they train on trauma-oriented and victim-oriented approaches. We see changes in approaches now. For example, in the last year, survivors who are referred to us for legal assistance say that the Witnesses and the Victim Support Center of General Prosecutor Office has identified all their needs and provides them with assistance. We also see that number of survivors who are forced to tell their story multiple times is decreasing. Investigators and prosecutors are increasingly involving psychologists in interviews with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Positive changes are noticeable. However, at the same time, prosecutors and investigators are leaving due to heavy workloads, lack of leave, and lack of support. This is a major challenge for the justice system, which due to the war and professional fatigues is losing those who have been trained and work well. We now include topics related to supporting professionals' mental health and vicarious trauma in all our training programs. However, going forward, it is important to think about how to support professionals who work in the witnesses and victim support system. It is also important note that it's very important to train professionals who work not only with conflict-related sexual violence cases, but with gender-based violence in general, in order to build a system of trust in the justice system. A victim-oriented approach must be integrated into all gender-based violence cases. That is why we work not only with investigators and prosecutors who investigate war crimes, but also with those who investigate ordinary crimes, such as sexual violence and domestic violence. I think that only if we take a comprehensive approach to implementing survivors-oriented approach, we will achieve change in practice and legislation, as well as in society.
A helpful illustration of the importance of training, not only for this particular form of gender-based violence, but for other forms as well. I want to talk about community recovery. Esther, I'm going to come back to you. You've described conflict-related sexual violence as a weapon of mass destruction that maximizes harm. And in the aftermath, we often focus on individual experience of harm, overlooking the ways that sexual violence destabilizes and reverberates across families, institutions, and entire communities. How has sexual violence affected the communities you've worked with in Guinea, in Darfur, in Syria, and what responses have proven most effective, not only in healing collective trauma, but also in promoting stability after a conflict ends?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, for that question. And let me perhaps explain a little bit that mass destruction part of your question. And forgive me to be quite direct or graphic here even, but I do think it is important to sometimes set out what we're talking about. So, for example, a child that's been subjected to sexual violence in front of the eyes of her own father, or a husband that is forced to harm a female relative while others are having to watch. And these are not patterns that are made up. No, forced witnessing is very common actually when sexual violence is used as a weapon of war. Like Cheryl, you mentioned in your introduction, Dr. Mukwege, describing this weapon that can be so terribly effective. So that is really what we're talking about. And then imagine what happens with the family. All the individuals in the family break, and the relationships within the family become really complex. And same at the community level, the entire community feels outraged and also ashamed, feels hurt. Their livelihoods are affected, their customs, for example, marriage customs can be affected. So what we see from our work is responding to that collective trauma requires really multi-layered interventions. I want to mention the work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, where survivors received individual therapy or counseling. Then there was group therapy, but there were also sessions with family members to ensure that they too have access to counseling, but also that they support survivors in this reparative process. The work with community leaders is really important. With the husbands was crucial. Survivors actually asked themselves to co-create positive masculinity workshops with their husband, which would allow the survivors to receive the compensation with the approval of their husband to spend it in their own desired way. Central African Republic, also a really beautiful example, I think, where group sessions were conducted with a wider community to redefine together what are our common community values, which were destroyed when the violence took place. But all of that, the counseling and the counseling, the therapy, the group work, etc., it will not be sufficient if there's not a more holistic approach, which also really addresses those concrete measures that help survivors rebuild their lives, but also contribute economically to their families and to their communities is really, really crucial. So survivors receive, for example, financial compensation, business support, they participate in village loan schemes. And what we're seeing now is that has a real positive impact on the community. They are creating new markets, they are employing others. And then sometimes survivors ask, for example, collective measures, a community center that is to the benefit of all. We see around the world that survivors really want to act in solidarity. Once they are healing, they always insist on helping others, helping to rebuild their community. And that way also assures some sort of acceptance and even admiration from wider communities. And I think that too is really an important aspect of collective healing.
There's a very clear link there between the recovery of individuals and the recovery and stability of entire communities. Aina, it has been 30 years since the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and yet new conflicts continue to arise in which sexual violence is used as a tool of war. What lessons can be drawn from your experience about how societies can rebuild and foster cohesion and stability in communities after conflict?
Yeah. Yeah, it's always a hard question to answer, but what I have learned, I'm just 33 and I'm trying still to find the best answer when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina. But in this moment, what I can say is that societies do not heal by pretending that past didn't happen. And that is really something bigger problem, because I think that we can heal if we face truth, really honest, and when we give space to those who lived those consequences of the conflict. And I'm very aware here in Bosnia and Herzegovina that rebuilding social cohesion is a long-term process, but it's not something that is going to happen automatically once the violence stops, and that's it. But in this still highly ethnic environment, I see that this social cohesion and this peace-building process, it requires political will, it requires strong institution and commitment to protect and include, for example, survivors and children born out of war. But in a bigger picture, maybe one of the lessons learned is that silence sometimes can be dangerous, because we saw that in Bosnia. For example, again, children born out of war, they live without recognition. They often carrying stigma that they didn't create. And I think that breaking the silence is really important, because when society finally acknowledge children or other victims, when state recognize you and say, okay, you are belong here, your rights matter. I think that in that moment, door is open for healing, not just for individuals, but also for whole communities. And also, one of the important things maybe to emphasize is that this healing process and social cohesion, it cannot be formed if we have selective empathy. And that's something that we often see in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because we need to understand that every survivor story matters, and that every category of victim must be recognized. Because if we have anyone excluded from this process, we're gonna create some hidden fractures that gonna show up sometimes later, and I think that we should, it's something that we have to think about, that we include everyone and understand everyone, even though sometimes it's really hard, but we have to do this way. And yeah, I think that's something that I have learned in this process. And the only thing also that I can add on the end is that in this moment for Bosnia and Herzegovina, the biggest effort that now we are putting in our youth and formal education. And that's, I think, something that it has to be done in all different post-conflict societies if we want to talk about responsibility and prevention of war and war consequences in the future.
Important lessons for any community recovering from this kind of violence and conflict. Grace, given your extensive work with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in northern Uganda, including efforts to support the estimated 8,000 children born during the conflict and facilitate their reintegration into communities, what strategies do you think have proven most effective in helping communities in Uganda rebuild and strengthen cohesion after the conflict?
Unfortunately, that has not been yet successful in my country. In northern Uganda, we are still in the process of, we are still waiting for the enactment of the National Transitional Justice. It is overdue, so I can say we are still in that process. However, what I can recommend for this situation is, like we always say, is like a timely intervention to kind of help not to escalate the impact of the already limping situation that women and children are facing. It is overdue. My advocacy is that I advocate, or my recommendation is that any intervention should be in a timely manner to ensure that we don't escalate the impact of that. And then when it is being done, it should be done with survivors and implemented with survivors.
a prescription for action on this issue for all working on it. From Ukraine, which we talked about, to Bosnia, to Uganda, support for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, I'm hearing from all of you, has taken different forms. And I now want to pull in a question from our participants who are with us and watching today. What will it take to move from a world that simply acknowledges the harm of this crime to one that actually repairs it? And what gives each of you hope, given the number of conflicts raging around the world today in which sexual violence continues to be used as a tool of war? I'm going to ask for a closing word from each of you. Christina, let's start with you.
Thank you, Rachel. Last month, my organization, Ukrainian Women Lawyer Association, EURFEM, sent to UN Special Reporter on Torture some submission. This submission we prepared together with organization united by survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And this submission include many recommendations to international communities and many sentences which we want share. But now I would like to mention two important recommendations that we have included to the submission, and it's some call to action to international community, and I believe that we can do this. First of all, it's of course provide sustained financial and technical support for Ukrainian separation system, including through the use of frozen Russian assets. Second, it's insist on the immediate inclusion of the Russian Federation in the annex to the UN Secretary General Annual Report on CRSV list of shame in accordance with the UN Resolution 1960 as a necessary measure of recognition and accountability. It is very important understand that we cannot live and work in double standards when perpetrators continue be member of any international organization and community. We cannot guarantee our survivors of war crimes in general or conflict-related sexual violence any justice and responsibility if we see some situation when international community don't react very quickly and effective on all war crimes, crimes against humanity and crime of aggression which committed by Russian Federation or crimes committed by other aggressors in other country. It means that we as a civil society organization, international organization, a special international agency have enough power, have enough mechanism and instrument held accountable all perpetrators and guarantee reparation, compensation of all survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and other crimes. And I think it's very important now and we have enough power for this.
A good reason to be hopeful. Thank you for that, Christina. Esther, I'm going to turn to you next. What gives you hope given the ways in which sexual violence continues to be used as a tool of war around the world?
Well, one thing that gives me hope is that I think we're moving very slowly and gradually away from a too narrow understanding of justice. Justice really being more than a perpetrator going to prison, but also reparative justice. Although investments have been really lagging behind there, we do see more interest for this now. It's an area where survivors can really truly be helped, but also get a sense of justice. Hope, I think, in all fairness, sometimes it is hard to have hope. 20 years ago in Darfur, you will all remember it, sexual violence was systematically used as a tactic of war and genocide. And today, what has changed? Again, there's possibly thousands of new survivors, so history is being repeated with a very little outcry, I should say, at the international level. Similarly for DRC and other countries. But I think what is different today and that gives me hope is that all around the world, survivors are making their voices heard. They are no longer silenced collectively, and we're learning from their solutions. I think that's really important, and that also applies to the national civil society organizations, of whom we have 3 representatives here. I think you are working on the front lines working with survivors, and you are all my source of hope, I would say.
The folks gathered here and the work you're doing certainly cause for optimism about change in the future. Ina, over to you. What gives you hope given the challenges we're seeing around the world?
Yeah, basically what Esther said. I think it's for me, it's also this. My hope is this moment of growing global movement of survivors. And as a child, I think that was crucial for me in the moment when I started to even think about being active in this and being no longer silent about origin and identity. And I think that survivor leadership is something that is creating a real pressure. They change the norms and they proving that reparations are not impossible; they are necessary. And I think that survivors are the reason, and their energy and their strength are the reasons why we have this survivor-centered approach, and they are included and they know what they need. And I think that that's something that is really important. Even though we are not even, when it comes to the children born out of war, my biggest motivation and my biggest hope is that tomorrow we can gather also more children and to have more groups for some global advocacy process for well-being of the children born out of war, because I think it's a topic that is well known, but still I think any kind of peer support is something that is really important. But yeah, from my opinion, survivor strength is the biggest hope that I have in this moment.
Ship of survivors, really the guidepost going forward on how to make progress on this issue. Grace, over to you. You mentioned how much work there is still to do in Uganda. How hopeful do you feel on the progress that's possible going forward?
All we need is political will in Uganda for us to have that bill signed or worked on so that it can translate. And yeah, in a survivor-centered manner. Of course, I know it is already late, but it's not yet too late. If something is done about it, that will be the hope of survivors. Otherwise, survivors are hopeless because of the long period that we have waited for the bill. So, and same everywhere, a timely intervention, and then making sure that any intervention done has a lasting impact by involving survivors. Thank you.
Hope in concrete policy action. Those are words of wisdom, I think, for all of us who care about this issue. Well, there is no doubt that there's much work still to be done to finally realize justice and support for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and for broader communities around the world. But there is no doubt that our panelists today have helped illuminate the path forward. Thank you all for your work, for your leadership, and for being with us. And now for closing remarks, I will turn to Jean-Marie Guénaud, the Arnold Saltzman Professor of Practice in International and Public Affairs and Director of the Kent Global Leadership Program on Conflict Resolution at Columbia. Jean-Marie, over to you.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you to all the panelists for a very thoughtful and important discussion. I'm personally committed to what we have heard today because I remember very well being in a big stadium in Kinshasa, and nobody was talking. That was almost 20 years ago now. Nobody was talking about sexual violence, and I raised the issue, and the tens of thousands of women who were in the stadium suddenly felt they were not invisible. I use this word invisible that some of you have used because I think it's really at the heart of what we are fighting against. Now, this question of reparations is always a very difficult one. It's difficult because it's about rights and not just needs. If we consider it just as an issue of addressing the needs, that's very important to address the needs. but it's about human rights. It's about the dignity of the people affected. And that's why I believe that it's so important as we discuss it to address it in a broader framework, in a framework where justice is part of it. Reparations without justice, they can't just be a way to buy silence, to buy to forget about the issue. Justice without reparation is empty for the victim. So the link between justice and reparations is really essential in all matters of reparations. And when it comes to conflict-related sexual violence, I believe it's even more important, this connection between reparations and justice, because what I've seen in so many conflicts I've been involved in, whether it's Democratic Republic of Congo, but it's also Sierra Leone, it's Timor-Leste, it's very different places, very different conflicts, but everywhere sexual violence is about destroying our shared humanity. It's about destroying the fabric of society. I was very struck by what Esther said when she spoke about the witnesses and about how having witnesses to watch horrific acts of sexual violence is part and parcel of this of sexual violence, and that really goes to the heart of what we are discussing. Making sure that the links of humanity in a family, in a society, are ripped apart. That's what we are up against. And that's why also with children, it's so important, because it brings the intergenerational issue of the harm to the fore. How will children who were maybe babies when the conflict ended, they are still bearing the stigma of their birth, the conditions of their birth. And so if we want to repair not just the victims, but the whole of society, we do need to have a whole of society effort that addresses generations, because at the end of the day, what is at stake, and I use another word that was used by the panelists and which I find extremely important, is the word dignity. It's about the dignity of human beings. If we do not acknowledge that dignity, if we do not work as a society to restore that dignity, then we haven't done enough. And the harm that has been caused to the victims, but also to the whole of society, will endure. That's why I'm so proud to be part of that conversation. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, panelists, for contributing to what is so important if we want to have a more humane society.